We're going to get started. Thanks for being here. This is the first of kind of our Sunday morning adult ed focuses. We've kind of set aside the third Sunday of each month to talk a little bit about different issues as we talk about social ministry. This year we're focusing on different spotlight issues. We had about 30 people who participated in some discernment with us this summer around what are issues you want to talk about, what are issues you think are important to talk about with regards to common good, with regards to injustice, with regards to health and wholeness. And so this month we focused on what does it mean to be a public church? How do we be church in the public square? And we'll talk a little bit about that today. And we're going to look at this document that looks really boring and rather pedantic, but I promise it's interesting. And we'll talk a little bit about the church's social statement on how does the church interact with society and how does it not. We'll talk a little bit about church and state and some other pieces, but I want to know why you came. We're going to be more interactive today than normal. And so if we'll start over here with Pam, and we'll put her on the spot. Just say who you are and one thing you're interested in learning, or one reason you came.
So I'm Pam, and I'm the social ministry chair, and I am supporting Pastor Matt in this grand vision for what we're doing this year in social ministry. And like Pastor Matt said, we facilitated a couple of listening sessions to try to discern what some big issues are that people are wondering about, and then how the church is I can't even say it.
Juxtaposed.
Thank you. With that, because what I didn't know as we were developing this idea is that we have church social statements, ELCA social statements, and social commentary on a lot of different issues, and I was amazed at the breadth of the issues, and we've chosen several of those to talk about this kind of school year in social ministry. So stay tuned, because we're going to have many more participants for the community, and some volunteer opportunities. So if you want to just do something like we've all been hearing after a lot of the gun violence issues lately, we're going to pop up some places that you can go help out, basically, because there's plenty of different organizations that need help. So thank you for coming today, and thank you, Pastor Matt, for all that you've done to launch this.
Hi, come on in.
Hello.
Get some space. We'll make space in the circles right here.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you again.
Nice to meet you.
All right, Trudy, who are you? And well, I outed your name, so tell us why you're here. Yeah, you can introduce yourself.
Yes, I am Trudy, and I've been reading more history lately than I have in the past, and it's made me increasingly aware of the underlying problems with the way our laws are written. And so I am always looking for some way to address those issues.
Great, thanks.
So I guess I'm interested in how the church plays a role in society, especially in American life. Churches has this central role, and but yet there is the separation of church and state. So how do we find that interaction is an interesting question. So yeah.
Great, thanks.
I'm Ed Ross. I guess just here as a member of the council, seeing what's going on, seeing where the interest lies.
Cool. You can give the report then. Liking that.
Checking up on the pastor.
I'm Gordon Malin. My feelings are pretty much similar to Dan. The responsibility that we have as we claim to be Christians and Lutherans in what's going on in our society, and what, I won't say if anything, because I know there's plenty that we need to do. Where do we start?
Just say who you are and why you're here.
Okay. So my name is Teresa Sieg, and this is my husband, Sean. We are members of a church in South Milwaukee, but we are exploring different churches, and we have 4 little boys that we just enrolled in Sunday school. And so we're here because they're here at the same time. And we thought that this might be another way to experience the church.
Great.
That's all I
I think she covered it.
I'm Tara, and if I'm being completely honest, I am here as well because my teenagers are in Sunday school right now. However, I was reading the ELCA statement on Sanctuary Church and saw this was available today, and then so.
Cool.
I'm Dave. I'm interested in what the church does and doesn't do outside of the church. There's a lot, and what the reasons for it are. We can be like somewhat a little bit insulated within the church community. So if we don't try to reach out, there's a lot that never gets done.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm Beth, and kind of along with what Dave said, I'm interested in how I, as an individual, can work through the church in creating justice for people in the world.
I love talking about sex and politics. I grew up as a Lutheran where you weren't supposed to, so.
Great.
Welcome.
And you're not telling anybody who you are.
No.
Right?
Caroline, you got 4 boys?
We do. Yes.
4 boys.
4 boys.
Are you the 4th one?
Yeah.
Hi.
The big fifth.
Yeah, we've got 4 little boys.
I am Petey Lund, and as I've grown older, I have become much more involved in the political climate in our country, and I realize that when I am writing to Senator Johnson, I often start out as a fellow Christian and a fellow Lutheran. How do you spell? I mean, what I'm really saying is that I really do feel that my faith compels me to be involved in what's happening in our world right now. And I say that often to our senators and to our local representatives.
Great, thanks.
I'm Chris Weber-Sponik, and I see Lutheranism as a movement, and we have Lutheranism calls us to care for all, our creation, our community, and to be responsible citizens. So this is just par for what I'm interested in.
Great, thanks.
I'm Nancy Bowen, and I'm on the social ministry committee, so this is what I do. So I came to support, see what's going on, what we can do to help. There's so many things to find, to stick your finger in, to hold on to.
We're cooking for Street Angels. Nancy basically arranged that this afternoon, so if anybody wants to just do something, there's an opportunity here later today to help out.
Great, we'll catch our other folks here. Who are you and why are you here?
Jim Sponik, and I'm with PD. I'm just really upset about the whole political climate. Just feel, what do we do? We stand up for things.
Yeah.
Lynn Thomas, and just kind of the same as other people have mentioned. I'm just looking for ways to feel like I'm doing something.
I'm Pastor Matt. I find all of these things really interesting, and over the past couple of months I've really been digging in a little bit more to the relationship between church and state. How is the church called to be a voice in the public arena, the public square? And especially for me, it's thinking about how does the church denominationally, how does the church regionally, how does the church here on this corner live in what I've come to steal from one of the books on the table in the center there, The Public Square. Did anyone here grow up in a town where there was a town square? Yeah, I did too. And Church Street, in many towns with the town square, was probably opposite from the courthouse. You know, you had the courthouse on one side and you had Church Street on the other. Red Wing, Minnesota is a great example of that. Church Street goes basically around 3/4 of the town square there. And so we live now in an era and in a time where religious participation is waning in many ways, in which the voice and the moral authority of the church is maybe less than it has been historically. I'm a member of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, and we often talk about if we issue a statement, the news doesn't really care. You know, what once was if a church said something, it made the news. That's fewer and far between, unless you follow, like, there's a really great Twitter feed. It's called Religious News Service, and their job is just to write and link to content that is religious news. And so, like, they come and cover church meetings, and they talk about it. I mean, so there's small pieces, but the role of the church in society is it was on the town square, and now we're maybe 6 blocks over in a one-way street with a dead end. You know, and so how do we as church evolve in how we do that? And at the same time, the question I have is how do we choose to speak and act as church? How do we empower individuals to speak and act in the ways that you feel called and allow for that big tent of our political values to coexist? I think that's the greatest challenge that we face. So that's, I'm emptying my backpack for you a little bit. And I want to empty my bookshelves a little bit too. So just a few different books that are out there, and you can take a look at these afterwards too. God's Politics is almost 20 years old. Jim Wallace, an evangelical, editor of Sojourners, which started as a movement, it's I think one of the best books out there, and the subtitle is intentionally partisan, why the left doesn't get it and the right gets it wrong. and saying Jesus is nowhere in our political, I mean, Jesus is everywhere, but that Jesus doesn't have a political party. It's his that's the overall, what's the word? The heart of his message. He has other books. He has a couple other new book coming out this fall. He's also part of a piece called the Matthew 25 movement that has been critical of national leaders, and many faith leaders are in that role. Parker Palmer, about 5 years ago, introduced Healing the Heart of Democracy. He's a Unitarian Universalist here from Wisconsin. And he writes about how do we recover civility in our democratic processes. We have had lots of conversations about that at church. Excuse me. There's a couple of books here that are small and new but powerful. They're called The Forgotten Luther and The Forgotten Luther 2. They came out with a second volume. And it's all written by Lutheran historians and theologians who are looking at what did Luther have to say about issues of justice, looking at poverty and economics, and also what does Luther say about engaging governmental leaders and other pieces. And so these historians and theologians have gone back and said, actually, there's a lot more here than we thought that either gets lost in the dustbins of history or was kind of avoided because there were other more important issues in the church at the time, or so on and so forth. The one book there is, I think, really interesting. I haven't finished reading it yet. It's called Public Faith in Action. It's written by other Protestants, and it's written more for church leaders, but I thought I'd bring it. One example in our church library is David Beckman. He's the former president of Bread for the World, which is like the leading interdenominational advocacy group. They do hunger-based public policy advocacy, writing letters. He has written a letter from our offerings, perhaps, sometimes, I know. And are working with bigger global national issues. And then I included here a new book. It just came in the mail on Thursday. It's written by a Roman Catholic. His name is Mike Gorman. And he has written a new book on different methods of interpreting the Bible, and there's a whole chapter on the Bible and politics, which I think is really, that's not typically part of here are the methods we have to interpret the Bible. The Bible and politics is not typically one that finds its way into textbooks for religion majors or pastors. All that said, there's a couple others that aren't here. If you've ever heard, and again, this is just for your information, there's a woman, Lutheran theologian from out in Seattle area. Her name is Cynthia Mo Lobita. She has a little volume about being the public church, really responding to lots of the questions and concerns you have. I thought I had that on my shelf, but I think my wife has it at her office because we share books. And then also a couple other pieces that are helpful. There's a Lutheran collection from 2003 about church and state, where a bunch of people wrote specific articles about that. So if that's really your bag, that book's coming from Amazon next week. So the shipping, it was so out of print. Says something about the interest in that, but also otherwise. My goal for the next half hour or so, I want to give you a 5-minute crash course in Lutheran history of civic engagement. Looking through, and then we're going to actually read parts of this document together, and I'm going to try to lead us through kind of a shared inquiry model where you become the speakers with us. So it's less here's what the pastor thinks and more let's sit around some questions and think about what we notice and what we read. And so we'll read that together. We won't read all 8 pages together, but I think this is just a really rich document. And our church has a number of social statements. Most of them cost today between $300,000 to $500,000 to complete a social statement. So the amount of time and energy and person power and public hearings and research and all those things, it's about $500,000 that goes into a social statement. On top of all the volunteers who will, share feedback and other pieces. I had no idea it was that much. People were asking for them at the national church meeting, and they're like, these cost a lot of money. And they're like, how much money? And they're like, a lot. Yeah, Trudy.
Well, I just wanted to add one comment.
Yeah.
When you were describing the church as it used to be right on Courthouse Square, and now it's blocks away. And in my opinion, one of the reasons we don't get much publicity is that more and more people are moving away from the printed word, which means that newspapers are failing and budgets are cut and reporters are let go, and therefore nobody's attending these meetings. We don't have somebody reading the budgets. We don't have somebody at the legislative sessions who is then reporting back that this is what is happening. And so if it's not news, if nobody knows about it, there's no influence.
Yeah, I think it'd be really hard to figure out. I've tried to, I consider myself a somewhat intelligent human being, and I've tried to follow a couple bills in the state legislature. I am just confused I'll get out.
Well, and it goes on and on
right,
and on.
The system is maybe intentionally, sorry, a camera world there, but it's inherently, I think, maybe more confusing, but also the media pieces. Yeah, I think it's a great insight. Okay, 5 minutes, history of Lutherans and public engagement. So Martin Luther, he was a bit of a public figure in 1500s in Germany. And as he is debating and fighting and eventually excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, most of what he's arguing about is around economic justice. It's also about theology, it's also about God, but it's also saying, hey, Rome, you're really like marketing and commodifying heaven. This is not a good deal for the common good. It's definitely not a good deal, and it's actually maybe oppressing or taking advantage of people who are impoverished, but who really care about the eternal ending place of their dead relatives. So we often think about Luther about fighting the Catholics over theology, but in some ways he's also fighting it from a place of engaging the well-being of the community, the common good. And so the hard part about how is Luther himself engaged in the public square, is that his political reality is much different than democracy in 21st century America. But the Augsburg Confession, our Lutheran documents, the Small Catechism, all see there being worth in what happens in the realm of rulers, in the realm of leaders. And so Luther, in many places, writes that government, especially good government, is a blessing from God. So if anyone here remember the Small Catechism, maybe? Give us this day our daily bread. What does this mean? Luther goes through a whole list of all the things that it means, including shoes, bread, a faithful spouse. Good government is part of daily bread for Luther in the Small Catechism. And interestingly, this kind of, for Luther, God gave good government as a gift of creation for the sake of protecting well-being of all people, for preserving peace and good order. Does that sound like government today? Well, a little bit yes, probably a little bit no. And so the understanding in the 1500s was that government's role was to maintain peace and to protect people's physical well-being and economic well-being. How do you do that? Fair, just laws, especially in the Middle Ages. How do you deal with contracts so you don't, screw over your neighbor? Rendering judicial decisions and other pieces. The other piece that's really important for how Luther understood government was that contrary to many other Protestants, the Anabaptists, Calvinists, and other historical church people, Luther saw there was no conflict between one being a Christian and one being a ruling person. So Luther is going out on a limb by saying, Lutherans don't exist yet, as we know them. Christians can and should be God's agents in government. Christians can and should be involved in the work of judicial system. Anabaptists are like, church good, government bad. And we see this in some of the Anabaptist movements still today, where we don't participate in government at all. In some Pennsylvania Dutch communities and other kind of Anabaptist traditions.
Well, moral majority crap, that's Anabaptist.
Well, the moral majority in the 70s, we'll get to the 60s and 70s in a minute, but some of that is rooted in Anabaptist tradition. The American Baptists up the street have a different, so depending on where you are, that's hard. I'm thinking more in terms of Mennonites, Quakers,
Peace, yeah.
more pieces like that. So Luther says you can be a Christian and be involved in government. In fact, it might be a holy calling, which is pretty revolutionary at the time as people are figuring out how do you be a Christian. Luther, has anyone ever heard here of two kingdoms?
Oh, yeah.
Two reigns? So this is often confusing, and I won't do good justice because I'm already like 3 minutes into a 5-minute thing and we're still at 15:20. But essentially what Luther says is that God has created both spiritual rule and God is in power and control over political rule. And that doesn't mean that God's in politics and not in the world, or God's not in politics and only in the world. It means God's in both, which is a pretty Lutheran understanding. That's like two kingdoms, like very dangerously reduced into nothing. If you want to learn more or have more conversation, I'm happy to do that. Send me an email or let's grab coffee. It's actually really interesting. It can be helpful for us. So let's fast forward to the 1960s. It's really in the 1960s that there's the next big shift for Lutherans in how they understand the role of church and state. Some of you may have lived through the Lutheran Church in the 1960s, so I'll defer to you on this a little bit. But so there's lots of different denominations that make up the ELCA today. And the two main ones are the ALC and the LCA. The alphabet soup quiz comes later. But nevertheless, both of these churches in the 60s, in response to the engaging civil discourse, in increasing political pressure and changes, all talk about the role of church and state. And in fact, the statements that they drafted in the 1960s are still the statements that are essentially effective for the ELCA today. We don't have a statement on church and state particularly. And so it means we revert back to these 1960s pieces. They're really interesting to read. I printed off a copy if you want to borrow it. But essentially, we have to remember the social canvas of that era means that Lutherans felt we have to reinterpret how do we engage with government. And so some of that was around civil rights. Some of that was around the role of church in public. There's even a section on taxation, prayer in schools, kind of all these pieces are part of it. And really, those were the debates of the era, even before the civil rights movement, kind of what is the role of religion in American life and society. And so, I turned the wrong page, sorry. In a nutshell, Lutherans between the 16th century and the 20th century make a big shift because the social world, way different, 1960, 15, 20, what's changed really? Everything. So now, the government is not just protecting people, it's also the arbiter of civil justice, guarding rights, both of individuals and collective people, especially with the First Amendment, which means that there is no one religion, but everyone's free to practice their own religion. And starting in the 1960s, government really takes on these roles of peace and justice and promoting freedom and responsibility and all of these different pieces. And so now, Lutherans begin to see, government's not just about preserving the well-being of people, it's also about enhancing people's ability to survive or to thrive, to fend for themselves, and to help give people power to be raised out of poverty, out of other pieces. And so the church's eye of justice becomes a little bit more focused on marginalized and oppressed peoples. As before, it was more regional. What do we need for ourselves or our community? As the scope of the world becomes larger, so too does the church. And it's really interesting. Here's what it says in the 1960s. It says, sorry, I lost the page here. Here we go. The phrase that gets used most of the time is that the church and the state should be institutionally separate, but functionally interactive. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Institutionally separate, but functionally interactive. So saying, church should do church, state should do state, but there are times and places where they need to function together. And they should function together. And most of those times are for the well-being of the common good or for the community, and more so for the oppressed. And really, it's not until now, in our current era of political divisiveness and kind of increasing polarization, there was a research that came out a few years ago that for the first time in history that they've tracked, people's political ideology, they ranked it as most important and not their religious values. So the survey question was, what guides you more in how you live? Political ideology for the first time came out ahead of religious or moral values and upbringing. And so the church has not yet sufficiently answered that, but that's kind of where we are now. How do we engage? And there are certain places where there's very little objection. Bread for the world, hunger. We might disagree on the how across the board politically. If we took a survey here, we might have 14 different ways that we would seek to end hunger. But hunger is a common unifying piece across Lutheranism, across denominations, across other pieces. But there's lots of dilemmas that the church faces now about how do we deal with welfare issues. How do we deal with immigration issues? How do we deal with gun control and abortion and amnesty and religious liberty? And so there's all of these now more fraught, more complex, definitely, and also more politically charged issues. And the church is kind of like, we need to say something, but what do we say and how do we say it in a way that both fulfills our role as church, and then how do we also respect the rights of others to disagree? And that's the place that I think that we're finding ourselves in. We're in, like, you ever spilled like sugary juice or soda on your kitchen floor, and you think you wipe it all up, and then like 3 days later you find that sticky spot? I feel like that's where the church is kind of living as to how do we engage. And my guess is if we took a survey, we'd all have a different opinion on how much the church should engage and how much not. What is the church? Is it the whole ELCA across America? Is it the Lutheran World Federation? Is it St. Matthew's Evangelical Lutheran Church here? We all have probably different understandings of what that church is too.
Yes.
And as we should.
Yes.
And so how do we not become a homogeneity factory of political perspectives, but how do we not let the tension and the divisiveness of the world interact and like stop us from being the church? So all that said, I want us to read a few sections of this social statement because I think it's fascinating. That was a 12-minute rant, and so thanks for your patience. But that's a little bit of setting the stage as to where we are. If you want to learn more, there's some really helpful articles. One last piece, and then we'll read. One challenge is to the role of pastors in this work. Some people, and I think it's a really hard place to live right now. Pastorally, our call in the ELCA's church constitution says that we're supposed to lift up the support of justice and wholeness and peace for all people. That's my own paraphrase. That's not the word for word. And so each pastor has their own opinion on what does that look like? Where does that happen? And so in any regard, I want to share this quote and then we'll read. The functions of church and state should not be confused. The church should not prescribe policy, and the government must not prescribe how or under what conditions the gospel is preached. So that's how the separation of church and state works. It's not church, stay out of state. It is kind of state, stay out of church. This is the line that, to me, defines the reality that I'm living in as a pastor, and I think we live in as Lutherans. It is not always easy for the church to discern where the line runs between justified admonition of these things are not according to God's will and unjustified interference in governmental affairs. That's just a hard line, right? And Luther would say we need to sin boldly and believe more boldly that our salvation is not dependent on those pieces, but sometimes the life of our neighbor might be. And so how do we navigate those pieces? I don't have a clear answer. If you have a clear answer, let's talk more afterwards. But I think this is a helpful place for our own learning to see where we're at. So if you want to turn here to page 2. Would someone like to read the last 2 paragraphs on page 2 and the first paragraph on page 3?
I'll go.
Okay, thanks, Pam.
The church in, but not from the world. Through faith in the gospel, the church already takes part in the reign of God announced by and embodied in Jesus. Yet it still awaits the resurrection of the dead and the fulfillment of the whole creation in God's promised future. In this time now, not yet, the church lives in 2 ages, the present age and the age to come. The church is in the world, but not from the world. The gospel does not take the church out of the world, but instead calls it to affirm and to enter more deeply into the world. Although in bondage to sin and death, The world is God's good creation, where because of love, God and Jesus Christ became flesh. The church and the world have a common destiny in the reign of God. The church acts for the sake of the world in hope and prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. The gospel does not allow the church to accommodate to the ways of the world. The presence and promise of God's reign makes the church restless and discontented with the world's brokenness and violence. Acting for the sake of God's world requires resisting and struggling against the evils of the world. Yay.
That's why we do this. So, what do you think? What do you think a restless church looks like, or what does it feel like?
Moving with the times.
Moving with the times. How so?
Not complacent. Not just.
Yeah. Any other ideas? Restless. What does a restless church look like?
Public demonstration, protest.
Could be public demonstration and protest. Yeah.
A desire to stay relevant.
Desire to stay relevant. That's awesome.
And I think resisting the temptation to say, well, we're okay, so everything's okay.
Mm. That's almost a definition of complacency. You know,
Yeah,
I'm okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's discontented, because when I first read it, I thought it was disconnected. Because I feel like other churches are disconnected. The world is broken, but we're protected inside, and we're self-focused.
Yeah.
I've been to churches like that.
Yeah. Sometimes seminary can feel that way. We're all trying to get through. That phrase, restless church, I want to plant that in our heads as we think about how is the church involved in society? What makes, and I think I heard it as we shared while we're here, there's reasons that there's discontent. And that might be lots of different pieces or reasons, but how might God call us to channel that restlessness towards something? What does that look like? How does that work in community? And not just, like, we could just follow all of my whims and fancies and we could do all these different things. Welcome to my class. But nevertheless, how do we unite ourselves around our common restlessness? That's another question that comes to my mind.
By making meals for the hungry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just doing something. Doing something.
My spouse is also a pastor, for new people in the room. And what she has taught her confirmation students is that it's often in an act of service, making a meal, that one becomes aware of the depth and complexity of the problems, the injustice. And then our faith calls us to explain, why is that? Why are there so many people in tents? What can we do? So that restlessness can often start out of a place of service, and then more, and then going down to those root depth, those deeper causes, and then going to action. Brian, behind us.
It's one of the things I like about what our church does in confirmation with sorting food down at Hunger Task Force, the mission trips that they do. It comes at it from our faith and religious perspective, but it's actually doing things for people regardless of what their faith is or is not, where that need is, and then coming back together and saying, okay, why are we doing that? How can we keep doing that? What are other things that we can do to send our faith out into the world?
Yeah.
I think that's the definition of Lutheranism, the movement, the action. But it's Brian, you said it so well. It's more than just the act. It's also the concern and the beyond.
Yeah.
Well, and what Luther says that it's God's action on our behalf and on the world's behalf that stirs that. And so that we believe that the Holy Spirit's actually doing something. whether that's making your heart ache or whether that's opening your perspective or other pieces.
And I do think that the other piece, or another piece, is being engaged in public policy making. That, I mean, you were talking about root causes, and that we're called absolutely to do both, to do the acts of service, and then to work at what will make the world more fair, more just.
Yeah. We're going to keep reading. That's great. That's a good pin in that. We're just going to like to read the last 2 paragraphs on page 3, and then the next, the first full paragraph on page 4.
This church must participate in social structures critically, for sin also is at work in the world. Social structures and processes combine life-giving and life-destroying dynamics in complex mixtures and in varying degrees. This church, therefore, must unite realism and vision, wisdom and courage in its social responsibility. It needs constantly to discern when to support and when to confront society's cultural patterns, values, and powers. As a reconciling and healing presence, this church is called to minister to human need with compassion and imagination. It strives to pioneer new ways of addressing emerging social problems and environmental degradation. This church has a responsibility to mediate conflict and to advocate just and peaceful resolution to the world's divisions. It should support institutions and policies that serve the common good and work with and learn from others in caring for and changing global society. And the next one.
And the next one, please.
Okay. As a prophetic presence, this church has the obligation to name and denounce the idols before which people bow, to identify the power of sin present in social structures, and to advocate in hope with poor and powerless people. When religious or secular structures, ideologies, or authorities claim to be absolute, this church says, we must obey God rather than any human authority. Acts 5:29. With Martin Luther, this church understands that to rebuke those in authority through God's word spoken publicly, boldly, and honestly is not seditious, but a praiseworthy, noble, and particularly great service to God.
Did anyone know that was part of our church's social teaching? This was written in 1991, for a little bit of reference. What do you think? What emerges as you engage with this? These few paragraphs. There's a lot of powerful punch here.
Boy, it takes a lot of courage.
Mm-hmm.
This church has the obligation to name and denounce the idols before which people bow.
There's some days where being the preacher on Sunday, especially with those economic texts, feels super hard, right? I'll speak that. That was my anxious laugh coming out. Yeah.
I think that sentence is a little bit over-sensational.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read those kind of texts, quite frankly, it kind of turns me off to the whole paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been better if they'd left that out. Clearly the author believes that, but I don't bow to anything
Yeah.
other than God.
the sentence, when religious or secular structures, ideologies, or authorities claim to be absolute, this church says we must obey God rather than any human authority. And I don't know it's necessarily, I think you're right, people bowing is maybe a little bit strong of a depiction, but I can think of examples in our society today where people follow and idolize, look up to secular structures or ideologies or authorities claiming to be absolute, where the church then should say, wait a minute, you're kind of following the wrong source here, you're looking up to the wrong source, you really need to look to God rather than these human sources.
Yeah, and that could be really hard to see even if we're in the midst of it. So I think back to the confessing church in Nazi Germany as an example. Now there's a place of the church and the state having, I skipped over that in our history, but the two different movements of Lutheranism within the Nazi era, where is God and what is God's will and who is carrying out God's task? Those questions were maybe not up for a fair debate in 1930s Germany, but those questions are up for debate, in many places. And so it can be hard sometimes to see where we are in these forests. To me, what trees are we by, and how are we and how are they all interconnected? The phrase of the year to me is, how do we look at this intersectionally? And so, what is it that, what are the structures or ideologies or authorities that I don't even know that I'm taking part in? A good example, we look at sometimes other church bodies more than the ELCA have challenged their pension systems. With whom are you really investing? That's just one way of thinking about this in a more, well, there's economic systems there's banking systems, there's finance, there's my own well-being, there's my family, boy, it's not just, Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not, but it's those complexities too that are in here, and that's specifically hard, I think.
I think for me another one is the sentence, we must obey God rather than any human authority. My obedience to God is much broader than the words that are written in the Bible, because God is present in the world today. Yeah. How do we interpret that? How do we know that? I don't think any of us have the answer to that one.
That's a great question, Gordon. Yeah.
I think what that paragraph brings to mind for me is, it's all about time. Because that's the gift that we have. We have time. We have life. Life equals time. What are we doing with our time? As a prophetic, and like even this afternoon, God, there's an exciting football game on. Who wants to be making peanut butter sandwiches when he could be,
watching the Vikings and the Packers?
Right. But this is what calls me. This spoke to me for this afternoon. What am I called to do? But I can't do it until after my nap.
Wait a minute.
Well, and that's where the last paragraph, which I didn't have Nancy read, is helpful. Because the church is human as well as divine, sinful as well as holy, it too lives under the law and the gospel. Like all communities, the church has institutional dimensions. We're all part of structures. The church must ensure its own corporate life, its relationships, and its efforts to influence society are still governed by God in how we express our identity and serve our mission. And so, that's where there's a place for conversation and deliberation, which we have like 2 minutes left. Ed has a thought. No. But I want to read one last section because this is the place that I think we are missing, or we need to really reclaim. And this is my own bias, so I'm laying everything out. But this is the piece that I think this last paragraph I want us to read is specifically hard. It's on the bottom of page 5. And that is, we are called to mutual and moral deliberation about these things. And I think that in that era now where political values are higher than religious values, becomes harder. Because we're coming to the table with different opinions on lots of issues. Immigration, I mean, the sanctuary piece, you can be in all sorts of places. And you can maybe even disagree with what the church has said or done. And I want there to be conversation about that. But when it's coming from a place of, I am this, I voted this way, and this is the church, then how do we have deliberation? That's, to me, the greatest challenge. But I'd like us to read just the top 2 paragraphs and then the first sentence of the bottom of page 5. So starting with a community of moral deliberation. Would someone read those first 2 paragraphs under that subheader and then the next sentence of the third?
Christian, go
Good.
ahead.
Good.
Christians fulfill their vocation diversely and are rich in the variety of the gifts of the Spirit. Therefore, they often disagree passionately on the kind of responses they make to social questions. United with Christ in all believers in baptism, Christians welcome and celebrate their diversity. Because they share common convictions of faith, they are free, indeed obligated, to deliberate together on the challenges they face in the world. Deliberation in this church gives attention both to God's Word and God's world, as well as to the relationship between them. This church sees the world in light of God's Word, and it grasps God's Word from its context in the world. This church must rely upon God's revelation, God's gift of reason, and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Scripture is the normative source in this church's deliberation. So what does that mean, normative source?
It means if we ain't starting there, we ain't starting in the right spot. So, in my mind, normative source is ELCA language for we believe that the Bible has something to say. We don't believe that the Bible has one and only one thing to say, which is different than our other Lutheran canon. And so it means that if we aren't starting with Scripture, that's where the moral deliberation starts. And maybe that's a way that we can use the church's convening power to really see where there is some common understanding and value on lots of these hard issues. You know, but to me, that I think that's the place personally where we're missing. I know many of my colleagues in churches across the country where their subtle and maybe unrealized goal is that they serve a church that is an echo chamber for their own theological and ideological beliefs. And I don't see that in this document. And sometimes I wish that we all thought it'd be a lot easier, it'd be a lot less conflict. I could just hang out and watch football and not worry about homelessness or hungry, or I'm speaking out of a little bit. I'm using exasperation and hyperbole for effect there, right? But how is it that we can convene around hard conversations, looking at Scripture, looking at our Lutheran history, looking at our faith and our values? We all bring our values with us. How do we go from there? So, thanks for engaging today. I would encourage you to read this whole document. It's rich and powerful. If you have questions or you want to fight with it, I'm happy to talk with you over coffee. I am not a universal defender of it, but stay tuned in the months to come. We'll have continued discussions looking at some of these other statements as well as about issues that are popping up. Next month is the opioid crisis and addiction and recovery.
You have the one for